Welcome to the basics of photography. Here, we'll take a look at the basic concept of photography in a camera and how we can apply these concepts to take better, sharper, and crisper photos. Let's start with the components required for photography: the camera body and lens. Camera body has various electronic components, including the sensor. Sensor is the component which captures the light and converts it to an image. Usually, the front of the camera has the mount, that is the place where lens can be attached to the camera body. And then there's the lens, which actually seeks the light. Typically, there are two types, one with interchangeable lens and the other with fixed lens. Fixed lens cameras, as the name suggests, the lens cannot be changed. When light hits the lens, it passes the light onto the sensor, thus enabling the camera body to capture the image. Now, let's talk about the lens, which actually does the job of the eyes when it comes to photography. Lenses have two primary characteristics. First one is the focal length. It defines field of view and magnification. Focal length is usually measured in millimeters. Smaller focal lengths have wide field of view and less magnification. Like you can see in this image, taken with a focal length of 21 millimeters. It covers a large area, that is field of view. Higher focal lengths have narrow field of view and higher magnification. Like you can see in this image, taken at 155 mm focal length. The second characteristic is called the aperture. Aperture is the opening in the lens to accept incoming light. Basically, larger the aperture, the more light that it can accept. Aperture is defined as a f number. Lower this number is, the larger the aperture. If you look at these examples of f1.4 and f1.8, you can see that the opening in 1.4 is larger than that of 1.8. This is called f-stop. This number is actually calculated by dividing the focal length of the lens by the physical diameter of the aperture opening. For example, f2.8 means the lens has an aperture with a diameter that is almost 1/3 the focal length of the lens. These depict smaller aperture sizes. Another example, if you have a 50 mm lens with an aperture diameter of 12.5 mm, the f-stop would be f4. When you hear something like raise the f-stop from 1.2 to 2, it means decrease the size of the aperture, thus reducing the amount of light entering the camera. If you hear something like lower the f-stop, it means increase the aperture to allow more light. Congratulations! Now you have learned how to read the complex lens specification. Usually you will see something like this. This might look confusing, but the most important characteristics of the lens, that is focal length and aperture, are here. That is 23 mm of focal length and f2 aperture. And since the focal length is constant, this is called as a prime lens. Usually only the highest aperture is mentioned because that's the most important. In this case, it's 2. That doesn't mean that aperture is constant. For example, aperture can go down to 8 or 16 also. Again, depends on the manufacturer. Another example, this one's different from the previous. In this case, the focal length is 100 mm to 400 mm, which means it's variable, and hence it's a zoom lens. User can control the focal length usually via a rotary dial on the lens. Also, the aperture is variable. What does that signify? That means that at 100 mm, maximum aperture is 5, but at a focal length of 400 mm, maximum aperture possible is 6.3. And the same linear ratio applies to focal lengths in between. Another way to look at it, when you're at 200 mm focal length, You will never get an aperture of 5 in this lens. It will always be more than 5. Another example, we are already familiar with the zoom focal length, but here it says f2.8. That means at any focal length that this lens supports, you can achieve a maximum aperture of 2.8. For example, if at 20 mm, you can get 2.8, and even at 50 mm, you can get 2.8. Even at the maximum focal length of 100 mm, you can get an aperture of 2.8. Aperture plays a very important role in depth of field. The depth of field is defined as the distance between the nearest and farthest objects that are acceptably in sharp focus. We will look at depth of field with real examples a little later. WR is water resistant, AF is autofocus, VR is vibration reduction, OS is optical stabilization. These depend on the manufacturer. Now that we have glanced at all the different components required for photography and their specifications, let's start with the most basic photography concept, the exposure triangle. These are three most important factors while taking a photograph. We've already talked about aperture, and we know that it's a feature of the camera lens, whereas the shutter and ISO have to do with the camera sensor. We are already familiar with the aperture size or the f-stop, and we know that smaller f value, which means bigger opening or aperture, which means more light can come in. This means the image will be more brighter as the f value becomes smaller. Shutter speed defines how long the camera sensor will accept light from the lens to form an image. What does that mean? Lesser the time the shutter remains open, that is, faster shutter speed, will yield crisper, sharper image. But if there's not enough light, the resulting image might be dark. You will do this for capturing sports or pets where the subject is not still. A faster shutter speed will always yield much crisper, sharper images. Now, the longer the shutter remains open, that is low shutter speed, the more light that can come in and brighter the image. But if there's movement of the subject or a camera shake, can induce motion blur. You will do this for capturing time lapse, landscape, and so on. Make sure you use a tripod for this. ISO is actually the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. Lower ISO values are less sensitive and also have less grains in the resulting image, whereas higher ISO values are sensitive to light and are better in low light situations, but ends up in image looking grainy. To get a good image, we got to balance these three parameters, and these parameters will depend on what you're capturing. There are more concepts that we'll look at later. Right now, let's look at the shooting modes. Your camera has built-in light meter and computation, which determines how to use the three parameters from the exposure triangle. In the auto mode, like what you see here, it will determine all three and you just have to point and shoot. In manual mode, like the M that you see, it's your responsibility to determine all three. This can get quite tricky in a time-sensitive situation, like wildlife photography, where the subject is not waiting for you to click. Shutter priority, like the S that you see here, you pick the shutter speed and ISO. Camera will determine the best aperture. It's usually mentioned as S or TV, which stands for time value on your camera dial. Aperture priority. You pick the aperture and ISO. Camera will determine the best shutter speed, usually mentioned as A or AV on your camera dial. Now let's apply these concepts and take actual photographs and observe them. This is the subject that I'll be shooting now. It's an electronic box with some connectors, and it's got associated text. This is another associated subject. There's plenty of natural light. Let's go ahead and shoot. This is my camera setup, mounted on a tripod. Subject is about 5 to 6 feet from the camera. This is the kind of information that you'll see in the camera's LCD view or the viewfinder. Let us see what some of this information represents. This is the shooting mode. In this case, it's A, which means aperture priority. This is the shutter speed. This is the aperture. This is the ISO. This is the autofocus mode. In this case, it's autofocus single. This is the autofocus area mode. And some of the options could be phase priority, wide area, normal area, subject tracking. These are some of the examples. Let's click and see what happens. Let's see the image that we just clicked. Let's zoom in. You can see that text is not very clear. There's some bleeding in the text. The quality of the image is not sharp. That's the associated subject. It's not a great picture. On the right hand side, you can see all the properties of the image that you just clicked. That's the aperture priority, the shutter speed, that's the aperture of 1.8 and the ISO. This image is not sharp. Let's try clicking again with the same settings. This image is also not very sharp. You can again see the bleeding of the text. And of course, the associated subject is also not clear. Remember the associated subject. We will take a look at it again in the next image. This is the next shot. Aperture is f8, shutter speed is 4 and ISO is 125. Let's see how the image looks. This image is much better. There's no bleeding of the text and the text itself is much sharper. And look at the associated subject. The front face is in focus. If you remember from a few seconds ago, the associated subject was blurred, whereas here it's sharp. This has got to do with the depth of field. Because we used a small aperture of f8 in this example, it resulted in a deeper field of view. That means more area will be in focus. This is important in different scenarios. Imagine clicking a photo of a landscape where you want a large area to be in focus. Imagine clicking a photo of a group of people standing in multiple rows. If you use a bigger aperture, that is lower f number, then people in only one row will be in focus. It's very important to choose the right aperture based on what you're shooting. We are in the shutter priority right now, as indicated by the S. You can see that when I change the shutter speed, the aperture also increases or decreases accordingly, while keeping the ISO constant at 125. The quote symbol next to the shutter speed indicates that it's in seconds. Let's take a picture. As you can see, the image is crisp and sharp. Even though the shutter speed was slow, that is 1 second, since the subject was not moving, it has produced a sharp image. And because the aperture was low at f18, even the associated subject is in focus. Let's click another photo. We are still in shutter priority. Let's increase ISO to 400. Shutter speed is 1 by 200th of a second and aperture is f1.8. Let's see how the picture will look. Again, this image is not that sharp. You can see some bleeding on the text. And also the associated subject is not in focus because we have used an aperture of 1.8. With that, we'll conclude this video. You will need to play around with the shutter speed, aperture and ISO to get the best image possible. Remember to always preview the image taken on the camera to ensure it looks okay. Never assume that the image was captured correctly. Always verify. As you master these techniques, you will encounter concepts like overall exposure, white balance, color profile, and so on. I'll make a separate video for these. Thank you for watching.